This is the story of a man who walked directly into that darkness. Unflinching and unprepared for what would unfold, a man whose knowledge of the law became the most dangerous weapon in a small-town station's arsenal. It was an ordinary evening that would become anything but ordinary, the kind of evening where nothing seemed to warn of the storm approaching. A judge, not presiding in a courtroom, but alone on an isolated stretch of rural highway, was about to discover that the badge he wore off-duty meant nothing to a man who wore a different kind of authority. Major Adrian Cross had spent decades navigating the labyrinthine corridors of military law. His career spanned continents and conflict zones. He had cross-examined hostile witnesses in war crime hearings. He had overturned convictions that seemed ironclad. He understood the Constitution not as a theoretical document, but as a breathing, living guarantee that separated civilized society from tyranny. On this particular Friday evening, he wasn't thinking about law at all. He was thinking about his sister's pecan pie, which he'd consumed 3 slices of during their Athens weekend. He was thinking about how the drive back gave him time to decompress before another week of brutal case preparation. His 2018 Honda Accord hummed along the highway, cruise control set at the legal limit, hands positioned exactly where they belonged on the steering wheel. What Adrian Cross wasn't thinking about was that he represented everything a certain small-town sheriff's deputy resented about the world changing around him. The highway stretched ahead, endless and quiet. Adrian had configured his vehicle for maximum visibility, windows slightly down, interior light off, nothing that could spark suspicion. He'd done this dance before, not in this county but in enough places across the American South that he recognized the pattern when it emerged in his mirror. The patrol car appeared first as distant headlights, then gradually closed the distance with predatory precision. Adrian noticed it the moment it veered into his lane, tailgating with the kind of aggression that suggested hostility rather than normal traffic. He didn't adjust his speed, he didn't brake sharply. He simply maintained his course, understanding exactly what was occurring. This was a pressure tactic, one designed to provoke an error, one designed to create a pretext. For the next 8 minutes, the cruiser stayed locked behind him, running him deliberately, pushing his patience rather than his vehicle. Adrian's breathing remained steady. His mind catalogued everything, the cruiser's designation visible through his rear window, the time on his dashboard display, the exact stretch of highway where this would eventually escalate. When the lights finally blazed to life, it came without warning, without incident, without justification. Adrian executed his stop with almost theatrical perfection. Right turn signal, gradual deceleration, plenty of distance between his bumper and the shoulder's edge, engine off. Windows open, keys positioned visibly on the dashboard. His hands remained precisely where they belonged on top of the steering wheel, fingers spread, palms forward. He wasn't afraid. Caution and fear weren't the same thing. He was cautious. He was prepared. Fear would have been a luxury he couldn't afford, so he simply didn't allow it. Deputy Marshal Dawson, no, Officer Travis Blackwood, emerged from the cruiser with the gait of someone accustomed to absolute dominion within his jurisdiction. He was broad-shouldered but soft-bodied, the kind of officer who'd let the uniform do most of the intimidating rather than genuine capability. His hand rested on his weapon, not in a practical way, but in a way designed to communicate threat. He approached the driver's side window, and Adrian's pulse remained exactly where it was. Calm, steady, controlled, license and registration, the officer commanded, not bothering with pleasantries. His voice carried a drawl thick enough to cut with a knife and contempt thick enough to taste. "Why did you pull me over?" Adrian asked, keeping his tone perfectly neutral, perfectly legal. "You were all over the road back there. License, registration now." Adrian understood what had just happened. The officer had created a narrative to justify what was already decided. Adrian had done nothing. The highway had been empty. His driving had been flawless. But the officer needed no actual violation. He needed only a justification he could convince himself to believe. "I haven't deviated from my lane, officer. I've maintained the posted speed limit the entire drive. If you've observed something specific, I'd like to know what it was." The officer's jaw clenched. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned, certainly not by someone who spoke with measured composure rather than defensive panic. Adrian retrieved his documentation slowly, narrating each movement. "My license is in the glove compartment. Permission to reach." The officer's irritation deepened. Adrian produced the documents, and the moment they exchanged hands, something shifted in the officer's demeanor. Adrian had seen it countless times, the officer registering that the driver wasn't frightened, wasn't deferential, wasn't behaving according to the script officers like this expected. The officer disappeared back to his cruiser for a stretch of time far longer than any reasonable administrative check would require. Adrian knew what was happening in that vehicle. The officer was sitting in his seat, running Adrian's information, finding nothing, and trying to figure out how to transform a completely legal encounter into something that would stick. Adrian's mind had moved into another space entirely. He was no longer a driver on a dark highway. He was a judge, and he was observing evidence. He was cataloging violations. He was building a case in real time. When the officer returned, his demeanor had transformed entirely. The casual contempt had crystallized into something harder, something genuine and potentially dangerous. "Step out of the vehicle. May I ask the basis for that request?" Adrian kept his hands visible, his tone conversational. "Have you issued a citation for the alleged lane violation? Step out of the damn car!" Adrian complied with perfect slowness, making certain any audio recording device in the patrol car captured his compliance. He stepped into the humid evening air, and the officer, still not having identified himself beyond what Adrian could read from a name-tag, commenced a pat-down that crossed every constitutional line Adrian had studied. The search was invasive. It was aggressive. It was designed to humiliate rather than to genuinely investigate. Adrian's wallet, phone, and keys clattered onto the vehicle's roof. "You know, you've got a lot of paperwork here," the officer said, voice dripping with contempt. "What exactly is it you do? You look like one of those civil rights lawyers, maybe. Ambulance chaser." Adrian said nothing. His silence seemed to antagonize the officer further. "Yeah, that's what I thought. Well, let me explain something to you. Out here, I am the law, not whatever fancy degrees you got, not whatever paperwork you carry." "Me." The younger officer, the one who'd remained by the cruiser, looked deeply uncomfortable with how this was proceeding. "I'm going to search this vehicle," the officer announced. "I smell marijuana." It was the oldest lie in the corrupt police playbook. The words were issued with such casual confidence that they might have seemed genuine to someone untrained. Adrian wasn't untrained. He'd seen this particular fabrication deployed exactly 47 times across various military installations and civilian jurisdictions. "I explicitly deny consent," Adrian stated clearly. "You have no warrant, no probable cause beyond your own fabrication, and no exigent circumstances. Any search violates the Fourth Amendment." The officer laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You think I need your permission?" What followed was a 20-minute violation of Adrian's vehicle. The officer tore through the interior, scattered documents, pulled cushions, examined the trunk. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. Adrian had made certain of that. When the officer emerged, red-faced and breathing hard, it became clear he'd escalated beyond simple harassment. He'd committed to a narrative he now had to see through. Resisting an officer. Suspicious behavior. Get in the cruiser. I haven't resisted anything. I've complied with every lawful command. Shut your mouth and get in the car. The drive to the county detention facility was designed to be brutal. The officer took corners sharply. The younger deputy rode silently in the front seat, clearly disturbed by the trajectory this had taken. Adrian didn't protest. He simply observed. The facility itself was what Adrian expected, underfunded, understaffed, operating in that peculiar zone where small-town authority often became completely unmoored from actual law. The intake room smelled of bleach and desperation. A sergeant behind protective glass looked up from his paperwork. "What we got, Travis?" "Got a smart mouth here who thought he could mouth off to a police officer." The sergeant examined Adrian with the kind of practiced assessment that suggested he'd processed hundreds of people through this room. Adrian could see the calculation occurring behind his eyes. Something about this situation didn't match the narrative being presented. "What exactly did he do?" the sergeant asked, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. "Pulled him over for swerving. Got nasty when I asked for his information. Started citing case law at me like he thought he was in some courtroom. Resisting?" Adrian stood perfectly straight, perfectly composed, perfectly aware that every moment was being recorded somewhere in this facility. "My name is Adrian Cross," he announced clearly. "I was unlawfully stopped without probable cause. I was unlawfully searched without consent or warrant. I was subjected to excessive force during the pat-down. I was detained without reasonable suspicion of any crime. I want to state that formally, for your records. The sergeant's eyes narrowed. You a lawyer? I'm a citizen, asserting my constitutional rights. Where are you headed? I'm heading home to Savannah. The sergeant made a calculation. What do you do? Adrian made a decision in that moment. He decided to tell the truth, but not the whole truth. Not yet. I work in the federal government. The officer, the one who'd conducted the stop, made a harsh, mocking sound. He's probably some kind of desk jockey, thinks that makes him better than everybody else. The sergeant ordered Adrian's handcuffs removed, much to the stopping officer's clear frustration. Adrian was processed through the standard procedures. His belongings were catalogued, his fingerprints were recorded. And then, while seated in a holding area, he made his one phone call. He dialed a number that connected him directly to a very specific office on a military installation. When the line was answered, his entire bearing shifted. The civilian who'd been quietly complying transformed into something else entirely, someone accustomed to command, to authority, to being obeyed without question. He explained his situation in military terminology. He provided the name of the officer, the facility, and the specific violations that had occurred. He was assured that resources were being mobilized. When he hung up that phone and turned back to face the intake room, everything had changed. The moment Adrian mentioned that federal authorities were en route was the moment the facility's entire atmosphere shifted. The sergeant's face went pale. The officer who'd made the stop began to realize, with dawning horror, that he'd made a catastrophic error. "Sir, we didn't realize," the sergeant began, but Adrian cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm aware of what you didn't realize." Adrian reached into his breast pocket, the one that the officer's rough pat-down had somehow missed, and withdrew a small leather credential holder. He opened it slowly, deliberately, allowing the gold badge of his office to catch the fluorescent light. "I am Judge Adrian Cross," he stated, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to having his words carry legal consequence. "I preside over federal military courts. I have served in this capacity for 2 decades, and I am advising you that my legal team and federal law enforcement are currently inbound to this facility." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when people suddenly understand they've made mistakes of staggering magnitude. "Judge Cross," the sergeant stammered, his previous composure completely evaporated, "I want to assure you that this was clearly some kind of misunderstanding." "No," Adrian replied coldly. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice made by an officer who decided that the badge he wore gave him permission to violate the constitutional rights of any person he encountered. A choice enabled by a department that apparently doesn't believe the law applies to its employees. The officer who'd made the stop tried to protest, to defend his actions, to claim he'd been doing his job. Adrian didn't even look at him. "You're going to see me in court," Adrian said quietly. "Not as a defendant, as the plaintiff." The arrival of the FBI was swift and professional. Agents entered the facility with the kind of precision that suggested they'd coordinated this operation meticulously. They seized the dash camera footage. They collected the body camera recordings. They took possession of the dispatch audio logs. Adrian was released into their custody, and the transformation was absolute. He was no longer a suspect in a small-town police station. He was a witness to federal crimes. He was a victim of civil rights violations. He was a problem for a lot of people who suddenly realized they'd chosen exactly the wrong person to harass. The drive away from that facility was the inverse of the drive to it. Adrian sat in a federal vehicle with agents who treated him with the kind of deference typically reserved for dignitaries or trauma survivors. He was offered medical evaluation, though he declined. His wrists bore clear evidence of the handcuffs' excessive tightness, bruising that would be documented, photographed, and preserved as evidence. 2 weeks passed. Adrian sat in the offices of one of the most ruthless civil rights litigation firms in the Southeast. His attorney, a woman named Patricia Stone, who'd built her reputation on dismantling corrupt police departments, reviewed evidence with the kind of meticulous attention that suggested she understood exactly how high the stakes had become. "The dash camera footage is devastating," Patricia explained, projecting video onto a screen. "It shows no swerving. It shows perfect lane discipline. And it captures the officer's voice, clearly stating that he pulled you over based on racial profiling. His exact words were about your vehicle being too nice for a black driver in his jurisdiction." Adrian watched himself on the screen, watched the traffic stop unfold with clinical detachment. He wasn't emotionally invested in what he was seeing. He was professionally engaged in analyzing evidence. There's more, Patricia continued. We obtained his internal affairs file. 22 excessive force complaints across 9 years. 18 of them filed by black motorists. 3 settlements, all covered by county insurance, all accompanied by non-disclosure agreements designed to prevent a pattern from becoming visible. The department knew, Adrian stated flatly. The department didn't just know. The sheriff actively encouraged these kinds of stops. There are communications between them discussing traffic citations as a revenue tool. Adrian leaned back in his chair. What about the rookie deputy who was present during the stop? He's cooperating with the FBI, completely breaking the blue line of silence. He's given a detailed affidavit explaining that the officer told him explicitly before the stop that he was targeting you based on race and vehicle value. The rookie also confirmed that the marijuana claim was fabricated, that it's a standard trick this officer uses to bypass the Fourth Amendment. Patricia smiled slightly. They offered 7 figures to settle quietly and make this go away. Adrian's response was immediate and unambiguous. No settlement. We're going to trial. 9 months later, the courtroom was packed. This case had attracted media attention from across the nation, a rare glimpse into the intersection of racial profiling and systematic police corruption in rural America. Adrian sat with perfect posture, dressed in an expensively tailored suit, surrounded by attorneys who understood exactly what they were fighting. The prosecution's case was built on testimony from the rookie deputy, on the digital evidence from the dash camera, on the communications between the officer and his superior, and on the documented pattern of misconduct that spanned years. The defense attorney attempted to characterize the officer as simply overzealous, simply making honest mistakes. The qualified immunity argument was deployed, suggesting that the officer had reasonably believed he was acting within the law. Patricia methodically disassembled each argument. Then came the moment that would define the trial. The defense made a tactical error. They put the officer on the stand. He testified that he genuinely believed Adrian was engaged in suspicious behavior. He claimed the marijuana smell was real. He suggested that Adrian's citation of case law was unusual and threatening. He presented himself as a dedicated officer doing his job under difficult circumstances. Patricia approached the podium during her cross-examination and said nothing for a long moment. She simply looked at the officer, letting the silence extend until it became uncomfortable. "Officer," she began, "while Colonel Cross was being detained in the intake room, you made a phone call to the sheriff. Is that correct?" The officer's face went pale. "I don't recall." Patricia pulled up a recording. "Allow me to refresh your memory." The audio played through the courtroom speakers, the officer's voice, panicked and urgent, admitting to the sheriff that he'd pulled Adrian over based on race, admitting that he'd fabricated the marijuana charge, admitting that he needed to delete the dash camera footage before the evidence could be reviewed. The courtroom fell silent. The jury's faces reflected the shock of hearing explicit, recorded confession of crimes. Patricia didn't need to ask further questions. She walked back to her seat and sat down. The case was over. It just took the jury 4 hours to formalize what everyone had already understood. The verdict was unanimous. The jury found in favor of Adrian on all counts: false imprisonment, assault, battery, violation of his Fourth Amendment rights, violation of his 14th Amendment rights, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The compensatory damages were $2 million. The punitive damages, designed not to compensate Adrian, but to punish and deter egregious misconduct, were a staggering $12 million, split between the officer, the sheriff, and the county. The officer received 8 years in federal prison. The sheriff eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy and served 3 years in minimum security. The county was placed under a federal consent decree requiring comprehensive reform, mandatory bias training, and external audits that would continue for years. But Adrian didn't keep a single dollar of his settlement. Instead, he established a foundation, the Cross Foundation for Constitutional Defense, dedicated to providing aggressive legal representation for marginalized citizens facing police misconduct in rural jurisdictions. He funded it with the entire settlement and continued funding it through his judicial salary. 6 months after the trial concluded, Adrian stood at a podium at the Army War College, dressed in his formal uniform, gold badge gleaming under the lights. He was addressing the next generation of military officers, men and women who would carry the responsibility of justice into an uncertain future. "The authority you will carry," Adrian began, his voice filling the auditorium, is not a personal possession, it's a trust. It's a responsibility that demands absolute integrity. When that authority is weaponized against the vulnerable, when it becomes a tool of oppression rather than protection, it doesn't just violate law, it violates the fundamental promise of democracy itself. He paused, letting his gaze move across the sea of young faces. I want to tell you about a night when I discovered that the uniform I wore to a courthouse held no power on a rural highway. I discovered that the badge in my pocket meant nothing to a man who'd decided to make his own authority supreme. I discovered what thousands of Americans have always known, that the law is only a law if it applies equally to everyone, and it's only protection if it protects everyone equally. Adrian's voice hardened slightly, taking on a weight that commanded absolute attention. You will face moments where you're tempted to believe that your position, your rank, your authority gives you permission to bend the law, to apply it selectively, to use it as a weapon against people you deem undeserving of protection. I'm here to tell you that those moments are tests, and the stakes are higher than you can imagine. He stepped back from the microphone, his expression grave. The law isn't a luxury item reserved for people the system likes. It's a fundamental right. And anyone who wears a uniform in service to this country has an obligation to protect it, to defend it, and to ensure it applies equally. No exceptions, no compromises, no qualifications based on who the person is or where they're from. The auditorium was completely silent. No one moved, no one spoke. They were simply listening to a man who'd been systematized, who'd fought back, and who'd won not because of his rank or his position, but because he understood something fundamental about American law that no badge or uniform could take away. This story isn't really about a military judge and a corrupt small-town officer. It's about a system being held accountable by someone who knew how to make that accountability inevitable. It's about the fact that justice, while it sometimes bends, ultimately bends toward those who understand how to apply pressure in exactly the right places. The trial that followed exposed a pattern of racial profiling that had operated for years in that jurisdiction. It revealed a department that didn't just enable misconduct, it encouraged and incentivized it. It showed that badge didn't grant immunity from the law, regardless of what the officer wearing it believed. But more than that, it demonstrated something crucial about resistance to injustice. Adrian Cross didn't win because he was special or privileged. He won because he remained calm, because he understood the law not as a theoretical concept but as a practical tool, because he documented everything and refused to be intimidated into accepting an unjust outcome. He also won because someone, the young deputy, eventually recognized that remaining silent made him complicit. His decision to cooperate with the FBI became the hinge upon which the entire case pivoted. It's a reminder that corruption often requires the participation of good people staying quiet, and justice sometimes requires good people finding the courage to speak. The foundation Adrian established continues today, providing legal representation to people across rural America who face similar situations, people who don't have military backgrounds or federal positions, but who deserve the same constitutional protections. It's a legacy that extends far beyond the courtroom into communities where the law has often been wielded as a weapon, rather than a shield. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that justice should apply equally, regardless of who you are or where you're from, then share it. Let people know that standing up to systems designed to oppress is possible. Let them know that understanding the law, remaining calm, and documenting everything are weapons more powerful than any physical resistance could ever be. And remember this: the next time you see someone willing to resist injustice, someone willing to fight back against a corrupt system, understand that they're not just fighting for themselves. They're fighting for everyone who comes after them, for the principle that the law means something, and for the hope that one day the system we've all been taught to trust might actually become worthy of that trust. The Cross Foundation for Constitutional Defense opened its doors 6 months after Adrian's trial concluded. The office was deliberately modest, not located in a prestigious downtown tower, but rather in a small building on the edge of Savannah's historic district. Adrian had insisted on this. He didn't want the appearance of privilege or exclusivity. He wanted accessibility. The first case came within weeks. Marcus Williams was a 43-year-old construction worker from a rural county in South Carolina. He'd been stopped by a state trooper for a broken taillight. During that stop, the officer had demanded to search his vehicle, Marcus had refused, citing his constitutional rights. The officer had arrested him anyway, claiming Marcus had been aggressive and uncooperative. No drugs were found, no weapons, no contraband. But Marcus had sat in jail for 6 days before bail was arranged, and the arrest was already creating consequences. His employer had hired someone else. His reputation in a small community, where everyone knew everyone, had been damaged, and the legal fees were beginning to mount. Patricia Stone, the attorney who'd prosecuted Adrian's case, personally took on Marcus's defense. She filed motions that were nearly identical to those she'd filed in Adrian's case. The constitutional violations were so clear, so unambiguous, that the state eventually dropped all charges and offered a settlement. But Adrian made sure that settlement included a formal apology, a documented admission that the stop had been pretextual, and a recorded statement from the trooper acknowledging that the search had been unconstitutional. Marcus Williams wasn't interested in money. He was interested in vindication. He wanted the record to show that he hadn't done anything wrong, that he'd been treated unjustly, and that the system had eventually acknowledged that injustice. The foundation paid for all of it. Word spread through rural communities with remarkable speed. When people faced police misconduct in jurisdictions where they had no resources to fight back, they began hearing about a foundation that would fight for them. The cases accumulated. A woman in Georgia pulled over for a suspicious lane change that was actually just her avoiding a pothole. A man in North Carolina arrested for disorderly conduct when he'd questioned why an officer was searching his trunk without consent. A teenager in Mississippi handcuffed and detained for failure to comply when his only crime was asking what he'd done. Each case followed the same trajectory. The Foundation's attorneys would review the evidence, they would identify the constitutional violations, they would prepare meticulously for trial, and they would win, not always through verdicts, but through the accumulation of legal precedent, documented patterns, and systematic exposure of departments that believed they operated above the law. But Adrian's impact extended beyond individual cases. His trial had drawn the attention of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Investigators began examining policing practices across rural jurisdictions with new intensity. They were looking for patterns, the same patterns that had emerged in Adrian's case but had gone unexamined for years. What they found was systematic. In county after county, investigations revealed that traffic citations were being used as pretexts for fishing expeditions. Departments were targeting drivers based on race, vehicle type, and out-of-state license plates. The marijuana smell, Adrian's case, had revealed this trick so dramatically that it became impossible for other departments to continue using it without drawing scrutiny. Federal oversight increased. The Justice Department began requiring outside audits of departments in jurisdictions with high rates of civil rights complaints. States began mandating implicit bias training, though Adrian was the first to acknowledge that training alone was insufficient. What was needed was accountability with teeth. The Oconee County Sheriff's Department, where Adrian's original arrest had occurred, became a case study in federal consent decrees. The department was required to completely rewrite its use of force policies. It was required to implement body camera policies that prevented officers from having any discretion about when cameras were activated. It was required to establish civilian review boards with actual power to investigate complaints. The reforms were expensive. The department had to hire consultants, retrain officers, and implement systems of accountability that had previously been entirely absent. Some officers resigned rather than accept the new oversight. Others adapted. A few actually seemed to recognize that being held accountable for their actions wasn't a restriction on justice. It was the foundation of it. Brian Dawson, the young officer who'd been present during Adrian's stop, became an unexpected symbol of something important: the possibility of redemption through choosing integrity over loyalty to corruption. After his testimony in Adrian's trial, Dawson couldn't remain in law enforcement in that county. The atmosphere had become hostile. Fellow officers viewed him as a traitor. His superiors made his job untenable. But rather than disappearing, rather than accepting blame for simply telling the truth, Dawson pursued a different path. Adrian's letter of recommendation helped him secure a position with a state-level investigative agency, a unit focused specifically on investigating police misconduct. It was specialized work, technically demanding, and it positioned Dawson in a role where his experience with corruption became an asset rather than a liability. 3 years after Adrian's trial, Dawson was instrumental in uncovering a pattern of sexual assault by officers in a neighboring county. His insider knowledge of how corrupt departments operated, how they concealed misconduct, and how they intimidated witnesses made him invaluable in that investigation. 6 officers were eventually charged. 3 were convicted. Adrian attended Dawson's wedding, a small ceremony in a state capital far from where either of them had begun their journey of accountability. It was a moment of profound recognition that sometimes the most important victories weren't the ones won in courtrooms. They were the ones won in people's hearts when they recognized that doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, even when it created consequences, was ultimately the only path forward. The ripple effects extended into the communities themselves. In rural areas that had been operating under the assumption that police authority was absolute and unquestionable, something shifted. Citizens began understanding that they had rights. They began documenting interactions with officers. They began speaking up when they witnessed misconduct. A small town in Louisiana saw 3 officers resign after citizens began systematically recording traffic stops and filing complaints whenever Fourth Amendment violations occurred. The department couldn't sustain that level of external scrutiny, and eventually, change became inevitable. In a South Carolina county, the sheriff who'd enabled misconduct was voted out of office. His successor ran explicitly on a platform of reform and accountability. She implemented the kinds of changes that the Justice Department had mandated in other jurisdictions, but she did it voluntarily, understanding that a department that operated with integrity was ultimately more effective than one that relied on fear and intimidation. The foundation began receiving letters from people whose lives had been upended by police misconduct years earlier, before Adrian's case, before the foundation existed. They wrote about how the case had given them hope that the system might eventually recognize what had happened to them. Some requested that the foundation reopen their cases, arguing that new precedent might finally provide the justice they'd been denied. Adrian personally reviewed each letter. He couldn't help everyone. The statute of limitations on many claims had passed, but he made sure that every letter received a response, that every person felt heard, and that each story was documented as part of the Foundation's broader archive of systemic injustice. Not everyone celebrated the changes that followed Adrian's case. Police unions pushed back against increased oversight. Departments complained about federal mandates that cost money and time. Officers argued that they were being asked to operate under impossible constraints, second-guessing every decision, unable to do their jobs effectively because they were constantly worried about legal consequences. Adrian addressed these arguments directly in lectures, in published essays, and in testimony before state legislatures. The claim that accountability interferes with effective policing is precisely backwards. He wrote in one influential op-ed, "Effective policing is built on legitimacy. Communities trust officers who operate with transparency, who respect constitutional rights, and who understand that the badge they wear is a responsibility rather than a license. An officer who must constantly worry about legal consequences isn't being constrained. He's being asked to do what he should have been doing all along, which is obeying the same laws he's sworn to uphold." But Adrian also acknowledged the complexity. Not all police misconduct was rooted in racism or intentional malice. Some emerged from poor training, from insufficient resources, from the stress of working in difficult circumstances. Some officers were genuinely trying to do the right thing but lacked the tools or the cultural support to do so effectively. The Foundation partnered with organizations focused on police reform to develop training programs. These weren't programs designed to punish officers, but to educate them, to explain why certain practices violated constitutional rights, to demonstrate the actual consequences of misconduct, and to offer alternative approaches that protected both communities and officers themselves. Some departments embraced these programs. Others resisted until federal mandates forced their participation. But slowly, incrementally, the conversation about policing began to shift. It became less about defending officers from accountability and more about building systems that protected everyone, communities, officers, and the integrity of law enforcement itself. Adrian's case attracted attention beyond American borders. Human rights organizations in other countries began examining how the United States addressed police misconduct. Legal scholars in Canada, The United Kingdom and Australia studied the trial transcripts and the subsequent federal oversight as a potential model for reform in their own jurisdictions. Adrian was invited to speak at international conferences on constitutional law and police accountability. He found himself in conversation with legal experts from around the world who were grappling with similar problems. How to hold law enforcement accountable when those same officers were the ones responsible for investigating themselves. The universality of the problem was striking. Rural policing, isolated departments, insufficient oversight, and systemic bias weren't uniquely American phenomena. They appeared in countries across continents, suggesting that the issues weren't accidental, but structural, emerging naturally whenever authority wasn't balanced by accountability. One particular case drew Adrian's attention. A man in a country Adrian couldn't publicly name was facing severe legal consequences for asserting his constitutional rights during a police stop. The parallels were so close to Adrian's own experience that Adrian made inquiries through international legal networks. Eventually, he was able to connect the individual with organizations that could provide support and representation. The case didn't resolve as cleanly as Adrian's had. The judicial system in that country was less developed, the protections weaker, the consequences more severe, but the attempt itself mattered. It demonstrated that the principles Adrian was fighting for, that law applies equally, that constitutional rights aren't conditional, that accountability isn't optional, were universal principles worth fighting for anywhere. What Adrian rarely discussed publicly was the personal cost of his decision to fight rather than settle. His original case had subjected him to intense scrutiny. Every aspect of his life was examined. His career decisions were questioned. His motives were analyzed. He received hate mail from people who believed he'd betrayed law enforcement as a whole, who suggested that he was a race baiter, or a publicity seeker, or someone trying to make a name for himself at the expense of real police officers. The psychological weight of that sustained hostility was substantial, though Adrian kept it private. He continued his duties as a military judge. He continued teaching at the War College. He maintained relationships with fellow officers who respected both his integrity and his refusal to let personal attacks dissuade him from his principles. But there were costs. Some career advancement opportunities dried up. Some colleagues maintained distance, uncertain whether associating with him too closely might affect their own standing. The retirement celebration he'd hoped to have when he eventually left the military took on a more muted quality than many of his contemporaries experienced. Adrian didn't regret these costs, but he acknowledged them both to himself and in private conversations with people close to him. The pursuit of justice wasn't costless. It required willingness to accept consequences, to endure criticism, to continue forward when support wasn't forthcoming. By the time Adrian reached his late 50s, the foundation had become established enough that it could operate partially independently of his direct involvement. A board of directors managed operations. A team of attorneys handled cases. An administrative staff managed the foundation's growing responsibilities. This allowed Adrian to shift his focus toward mentorship and policy work. He began working directly with law schools, encouraging students to consider careers in civil rights litigation. He established scholarships for students from marginalized communities who wanted to pursue law as a tool for social change rather than personal enrichment. One of these scholars was a young woman named Deshawn Martinez, who'd grown up in a rural area similar to the one where Adrian's original case had occurred. She'd witnessed police misconduct targeting her own family. She'd chosen law school specifically because of Adrian's case, specifically because she'd seen that it was possible to fight back and win. Adrian became her mentor not in a formal sense but through ongoing conversation, through access to resources, through introduction to other attorneys and judges who could help shape her career. By the time Deshawn graduated law school, she was already lined up to work for the foundation itself. This isn't just about defending people in court. Adrian told her during one of their conversations, it's about changing the culture of entire systems. It's about making misconduct costly enough and visible enough that departments can't tolerate it anymore. It's about ensuring that the next generation of officers understands that the uniform they wear doesn't exempt them from the law. Deshawn understood. She'd grown up understanding it. And she was part of a cohort of young attorneys who would carry the work forward, who would continue challenging systems of injustice, who would ensure that one man's victory in one courtroom became many people's victories across many jurisdictions. 10 years after his original detention, Adrian found himself driving on Route 441 again. Not by necessity. The highway wasn't the most direct route from Savannah to anywhere, but deliberately. He wanted to see the place again, to observe it with the perspective of someone who'd transformed it into something more than just a location of injustice. The location looked exactly the same. The same pines stretched toward the sky. The same asphalt stretched toward the horizon. Nothing physical had changed, but everything had changed. The Oconee County Sheriff's Department had been reformed. The officer who'd made the original stop was in federal prison, and the sheriff who'd enabled the misconduct was no longer in office. The department now operated under federal oversight, with body cameras recording every stop, with civilian review boards examining complaints, with policies designed to prevent the kind of racial profiling that had been systematic and unexamined for years. Adrian didn't stop at the exact location. There was nothing to see, no marker indicating that a constitutional violation had occurred there. But he did continue driving, thinking about how justice wasn't a destination but a direction, not a state that could be achieved and maintained indefinitely, but an ongoing process of vigilance, accountability, and commitment to principles that seemed obvious until you had to fight for them. By the Foundation's 10th anniversary, its scope had expanded far beyond individual legal representation. The organization had become a think tank for police reform. It published research documenting patterns of misconduct. It submitted amicus briefs in cases across the country where constitutional rights were being violated. It trained attorneys in civil rights litigation. It worked with police departments that were genuinely committed to reform, helping them implement systems that would prevent the kind of misconduct that had characterized so many rural jurisdictions. The Foundation also established a compensation fund for people who'd been victims of police misconduct before Adrian's case, before the reforms that followed, before systems of accountability had been implemented. These were people who'd never seen justice in courtrooms, who'd never received compensation, who'd simply absorbed the trauma of being treated unjustly and moved forward with their lives. Adrian believed they deserved acknowledgement. He believed the system owed them recognition, that what had happened to them was wrong, that it violated their constitutional rights, that they deserved support in processing that violation and moving forward. The compensation fund never had enough money to address every claim, never could fully heal every wound, but it represented something crucial, an acknowledgement that justice delayed was still owed, that systematic injustice couldn't be simply erased by reforms implemented after the fact, and that redemption required more than just punishing perpetrators. It required acknowledging victims, honoring their experiences, and ensuring that future generations wouldn't repeat the same violations. When Adrian finally retired from his position as a military judge, the War College invited him to deliver a final lecture. He accepted, understanding the symbolic weight of what was being requested. The auditorium was packed, not just with military officers, but with civil rights attorneys, law students, journalists, and advocates who'd been touched by Adrian's work in one way or another. The energy in the room was palpable, charged with recognition that this was a moment of historical significance. Adrian stood at the podium in his dress uniform, all medals gleaming, the gold badge of his office catching the light exactly as it had a decade earlier. "When I began my career as a military judge," he started, his voice steady and measured, "I believed in the law abstractly. I believed in constitutional principles, not because I'd lived them, but because I'd studied them. I believed that the system worked as advertised, that justice was available to all, that constitutional protections meant something concrete." He paused, allowing the room to settle into complete silence. "I was fortunate," he continued, "to learn through personal experience that my beliefs were incomplete. I learned that the law doesn't protect you unless you're willing to fight for it. I learned that constitutional rights aren't self-executing, they require people willing to assert them, willing to document violations, willing to refuse to accept injustice as inevitable." Adrian's gaze moved across the room, connecting with individuals throughout the auditorium. "I'm not special," he said flatly. "I'm not more intelligent than thousands of other people who've faced similar violations. I'm not more courageous than people who've resisted injustice with far fewer resources. I'm simply someone who had access to knowledge, legal knowledge, institutional knowledge, knowledge about how systems work, and I was willing to use that knowledge to fight back." He let that settle. "What I want the next generation to understand is that you have the same access to knowledge. You have the same capacity to fight back." And you have an obligation to do so, not just when the violation affects you personally, but when it affects anyone within your sphere of awareness. Adrian stepped back from the microphone, his voice dropping but carrying a weight that filled the auditorium. The law will be what you make it. The system will function as you allow it to function. Justice is not something that exists independently and simply needs to be accessed. Justice is something that must be created, maintained, defended, and renewed by people in every generation who refuse to accept that injustice is simply the cost of living in a flawed system. The arc of history doesn't bend toward justice on its own. It bends because people decide to bend it. And I'm asking you to be among those people. 20 years after the night Adrian was detained on Route 441, the foundation he established had represented over 300 cases involving police misconduct. It had trained hundreds of attorneys in civil rights litigation. It had published research that influenced police reform policies in more than 40 states. Adrian himself had stepped away from daily operations, though he remained deeply involved in strategic direction and mentorship. He spent his time writing, teaching, and continuing to advocate for systems that would make his own experience less likely for future generations. The officer who'd made the original stop, Tavon Grantham, had served his 8-year federal sentence and been released. Adrian had no animosity toward him. He'd moved beyond that emotional territory long ago. But he was aware that Grantham would carry the consequences of his choices for the rest of his life, would be unable to work in law enforcement again, would be defined by the moment when he'd made a decision that had altered everything. The young deputy, Brian Dawson, had become a respected investigator focused specifically on police corruption. He'd helped dismantle a dozen corrupt departments and ensured that hundreds of officers were held accountable for misconduct. He'd become, in many ways, a living embodiment of the principle that choosing integrity over institutional loyalty was possible and powerful. The foundation continued growing, continued challenging injustice, continued insisting that constitutional rights meant something real and that the system would be held accountable for protecting them. And somewhere on Route 441, traffic was still flowing. Officers were still making stops, but the climate had changed. The assumption that badge-wearing authority was unquestionable had been fundamentally challenged. The possibility that violations could be documented, prosecuted, and punished had become real. One man's refusal to accept injustice had transformed systems, and that transformation would continue echoing through generations, a constant reminder that justice isn't something that happens to you. It's something you fight for, insist upon, and refuse to accept when it's denied. That was Adrian Cross's legacy, and it would outlive him by decades, maybe centuries, but when it affects anyone within your sphere of awareness. Adrian stepped back from the microphone, his voice dropping but carrying a weight that filled the auditorium. The law will be what you make it. The system will function as you allow it to function. Justice is not something that exists independently and simply needs to be accessed. Justice is something that must be created, maintained, defended, and renewed by people in every generation who refuse to accept that injustice is simply the cost of living in a flawed system. The arc of history doesn't bend toward justice on its own. It bends because people decide to bend it. And I'm asking you to be among those people. 20 years after the night Adrian was detained on Route 441, the foundation he established had represented over 300 cases involving police misconduct. It had trained hundreds of attorneys in civil rights litigation. It had published research that influenced police reform policies in more than 40 states. Adrian himself had stepped away from daily operations, though he remained deeply involved in strategic direction and mentorship. He spent his time writing, teaching, and continuing to advocate for systems that would make his own experience less likely for future generations. The officer who'd made the original stop, Tavon Grantham, had served his 8-year federal sentence and been released. Adrian had no animosity toward him. He'd moved beyond that emotional territory long ago. But he was aware that Grantham would carry the consequences of his choices for the rest of his life, would be unable to work in law enforcement again, would be defined by the moment when he'd made a decision that had altered everything. The young deputy, Brian Dawson, had become a respected investigator focused specifically on police corruption. He'd helped dismantle a dozen corrupt departments and ensured that hundreds of officers were held accountable for misconduct. He'd become, in many ways, a living embodiment of the principle that choosing integrity over institutional loyalty was possible and powerful. The foundation continued growing, continued challenging injustice, continued insisting that constitutional rights meant something real and that the system would be held accountable for protecting them. And somewhere on Route 441, traffic was still flowing. Officers were still making stops, but the climate had changed. The assumption that badge-wearing authority was unquestionable had been fundamentally challenged. The possibility that violations could be documented, prosecuted, and punished had become real. One man's refusal to accept injustice had transformed systems, and that transformation would continue echoing through generations, a constant reminder that justice isn't something that happens to you. It's something you fight for, insist upon, and refuse to accept when it's denied. That was Adrian Cross's legacy, and it would outlive him by decades, maybe centuries.